The cop's hand was already resting on his holster when he walked down the wooden dock, and Karen, the HOA president, was behind him waving her arms like she had just caught an escaped criminal red-handed, her shrill voice carrying across the still morning water as she shouted that I was trespassing on her lake, even though the deed to my cabin said otherwise. And in that absurd moment I thought to myself that only in this HOA-ruled corner of the world could a man be threatened with arrest for casting a fishing line into water that literally touched his own backyard, and that thought ignited a fire in me that would not go out until the entire balance of power shifted, not in their favor but in mine. The officer tried to keep a straight face as Karen yammered on about bylaws and regulations and unauthorized flotation devices, and I stood there dripping from a quick swim, holding my fishing rod in one hand and a half-eaten sandwich in the other, wondering if I was really about to be cuffed over a turkey on rye, while a couple of neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains as if watching the premiere of some strange rural courtroom drama come to life on the lakeshore. My first instinct was to laugh, but the cop's stern tone warned me that if I did, I might spend the night in county lockup, so I bit my tongue and let Karen screech about how the lake belonged to the HOA and how my family was a menace for daring to enjoy it without first bowing to her printed newsletter of rules, fines, and threats. But beneath her ranting I noticed something important, something that would change everything later: the nervous glances between the cop and Karen, the way he shifted uncomfortably when she barked at him to do his job, like even he knew this was nonsense. I calmly explained that my deed explicitly listed lake access as part of my property rights, and Karen snorted like a bull before a charge, waving papers she had printed off her HOA website, insisting that their rules superseded my deed, a statement so ludicrous I nearly choked on the last bite of my sandwich, but I played it cool, knowing that arguing with her was like reasoning with a hurricane. The cop asked for ID, I handed it over, and Karen leaned in as if to see my driver's license too, as though she were deputized in her own fantasy world, and I took note of how far she was willing to go to enforce control, how desperate she was to look powerful, and in that desperation I saw an opening. After 15 tense minutes the cop finally admitted there was nothing illegal about me being there, but warned me that continued disputes with the HOA could lead to civil complaints, and Karen pounced on that phrase like it was gospel, promising loudly that the HOA would take me to court and bleed me dry. I walked back to my cabin with my fishing rod over my shoulder, listening to Karen's shrill threats echo across the lake, and in that walk I started to piece together the real story behind this neighborhood, the cracks in the HOA's foundation, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, the only way to stop Karen wasn't to argue or fight her rules, but to flip the entire script on her in a way she could never recover from. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch overlooking the water, I replayed the morning scene in my mind, the way Karen's face turned red when the cop refused to arrest me, the way neighbors whispered among themselves afterward, and the way Karen barked at them to mind their business, like a tyrant worried her subjects might revolt. It made me laugh, but it also made me think, because her obsession with control had blinded her to something important. She wasn't actually in control of everything she thought she was. My old neighbor, Dave, shuffled over with a six-pack and plopped down in the chair next to me, chuckling that he'd never seen Karen so unglued, and in between sips he let slip a few details about the HOA's finances, how they had stretched themselves thin building a clubhouse and leasing part of the marina for events, and how dues were climbing every year to cover the costs. That nugget lodged itself in my brain like a spark hitting dry kindling. The next day, Karen marched down my driveway with a stack of violation notices, listing everything from an unapproved garden gnome to unauthorized water usage, and I signed each paper with a smile, handing them back like autograph. She left furious, muttering about liens and foreclosures, but I wasn't rattled, because I had already decided this was no longer about defending myself against her silly fines. This was about turning the tables so completely that she wouldn't see it coming. That night I pulled out my deed again, rereading every line, confirming what I already knew, that my lake access was protected and no HOA bylaw could erase it. I realized Karen's entire empire ran on intimidation, not law, and the cops' reluctance had proven it. Still, intimidation worked on most people, and that was why neighbors grumbled in private but rarely pushed back. Karen was like a queen ruling with fear, but queens fall when the people discover a bigger power behind the throne. I started making calls, asking subtle questions, digging through county records, and what I found left me both laughing and stunned. The marina that the HOA had been using as its crown jewel, the place where they held meetings, barbecues, and boat launches, wasn't actually owned by the HOA at all. It was leased, month to month, from a private company that was quietly bleeding money and looking to sell. In that instant, my frustration from the morning encounter turned into exhilaration, because I realized I had stumbled onto the perfect pressure point, the one thing Karen couldn't control but believed she did. As I drifted off to sleep that night, the sounds of crickets and lake water in the background, I thought about how Karen had gloated to the cop that the HOA controlled the entire lake, how she had waved those printed bylaws like a weapon, how she had laughed when she promised to take me to court, and I imagined her face when she found out that the one thing she thought gave her absolute authority could slip out of her hands in a matter of days. The idea was intoxicating, but I knew I had to play it smart. No rushing, no tipping my hand too early. I would endure the fines, the threats, the shouting, because each one would only make the reveal that much sweeter. The funny thing was, in her rage, Karen had actually given me the best hook for the revenge I was planning. She had called the cops to stop me from touching my own lake, trying to humiliate me in front of the neighborhood, but in doing so she had exposed the fragility of her control and handed me the motivation to dig deeper. Without that scene on the dock, without the absurdity of a cop almost arresting a man for eating a sandwich on his own property, I might never have uncovered the opportunity waiting in the shadows. Karen thought she had won the morning, but as I lay awake with a plan beginning to form, I knew that moment would be the seed of her undoing, because tomorrow I wasn't just going to fish in my lake. I was going to start reeling in the whole marina. The morning after Karen stormed down my driveway with her stack of violation slips, I woke up earlier than usual, the sun barely peeking over the treeline and casting long streaks of gold across the surface of the lake, but instead of grabbing my fishing pole I grabbed a notebook and a strong cup of coffee, because I knew I needed a plan that was bigger than just arguing with her over every ridiculous fine she threw my way, and the only way to beat someone like her was not to fight on the battlefield she controlled but to step outside of it and strike where she least expected. I scribbled notes about the marina, about what Dave had said regarding the HOA's thin finances, and about the way Karen had bragged to the cop about the lake belonging entirely to the HOA, and the more I thought about it the more absurd it became, because here was a woman who ruled like a queen but was building her castle on land she didn't even own. The idea made me laugh so hard I nearly spilled my coffee, and I realized that if I played this right, I could not just protect my rights but flip the entire balance of power, turning her own arrogance against her until she was left sputtering. So I started quietly digging, taking trips into town to visit the county clerk's office, pretending I was there for old fishing permits while really combing through property records, deeds, and leases. It turned out the marina was indeed leased month to month by a company based 2 counties over, a company that had once been flush with tourism cash but had lost revenue year after year as nearby developments drew more attention. They were in debt and worse, they were desperate to sell. The asking price wasn't small, but it wasn't astronomical either, especially considering the HOA had no savings to buy it outright. I felt a thrill run down my spine as I read the details, imagining the look on Karen's face when she realized her grand clubhouse parties, her fundraising barbecues, her boat slip rentals. All of it depended on property she didn't own and property that could change hands at any moment. On my way back from town, I stopped at a diner for lunch, and as luck would have it, I ran into a neighbor named Sarah who had always been polite but kept her distance, probably worried that siding with me might earn her Karen's wrath. But over pie and coffee she let slip that Karen had been making rounds again, whipping people into a frenzy about my so-called lake violations, promising new crackdowns and hinting at raising dues to fund a lawsuit against me. I laughed, but Sarah looked nervous, saying people were starting to grumble about how much money the HOA wasted and how Karen seemed more focused on controlling me than improving the neighborhood. I tucked that little detail away, because it meant Karen's empire was already cracking, and if I timed my move correctly, I could widen those cracks into a full collapse. Back at my cabin, I called a buddy of mine from college who now worked in real estate, someone I trusted to keep his mouth shut, and I explained the situation without giving away too many specifics. He laughed when I told him about the HOA calling the cops on me for fishing, but when I mentioned the marina his tone changed, and he said if I was serious about buying it, I needed to act fast because a property like that, even if struggling, wouldn't stay unsold for long. He offered to connect me with a lawyer who specialized in these kinds of transactions, someone who could draw up contracts quickly and discreetly, and I agreed. That night, as the crickets chirped and the lake lapped against the dock, I sat with pen and paper calculating what I would need, not just money but patience, secrecy, and the ability to let Karen keep thinking she was winning until the moment came to pull the rug out from under her. Meanwhile, Karen was doubling down on her campaign against me, plastering notices on my mailbox, snapping photos of my cabin as though she was building a case for the Supreme Court, and even shouting across the water one morning that she would see me bankrupted before the summer was out. I waved back cheerfully, which only made her more furious, but every insult she hurled only fueled my determination. The more she barked, the less I wanted to just defend myself, and the more I wanted to own the very ground she strutted on. And with each new notice I stuffed in a drawer, my resolve hardened, because I knew that while she was focused on petty fines, I was playing a bigger game entirely. The lawyer my friend recommended turned out to be sharp and discreet, a man named Mitchell who had handled similar cases before, and when I explained that I wanted to quietly purchase a marina currently leased by a local HOA, he chuckled knowingly, saying he had seen plenty of power-hungry neighborhood associations collapse when their illusions of control met the reality of property law. He promised confidentiality and laid out the steps I needed to take. Establish an LLC to shield my name, make an offer through the company, and move quickly before word got out. As we spoke, I felt the plan solidifying in my mind, no longer just an idea but a roadmap to real, crushing revenge. Of course, keeping quiet in a small lakeside community isn't easy, and I had to be careful not to arouse suspicion. I kept up appearances, mowing my lawn, waving to neighbors, even enduring Karen's tirades with a smile. At one HOA meeting, which I attended just to stir the pot, Karen tried to publicly shame me, holding up photographs of me sitting on my dock as if she had caught a hardened criminal, and I nearly burst out laughing when some of the members shifted uncomfortably, clearly tired of the theatrics. I kept my mouth shut, only muttering that I was sure the truth would come out soon enough, which earned me a glare that could have melted steel, but the moment passed, and Karen went back to her rants about bylaws and dues. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, paperwork was already being prepared that would turn her proudest asset into mine. Days turned into a week, and while Karen obsessed over me, I made trips out of town to meet with Mitchell and finalize the offer. The marina owners were more than eager to offload, their debts piling up, and when Mitchell hinted that my LLC was ready to pay cash, they nearly jumped at the chance. By the end of the week, contracts were drafted, inspections scheduled, and my heart raced every time I thought about how close I was to pulling this off. At night, lying in bed, I pictured Karen's face when she realized the place where she held her meetings and picnics and power plays now belonged to the man she tried to humiliate on the lake. It was almost too delicious to imagine. The irony was that Karen herself helped keep my cover intact, because she was so busy waging war against me with fines and threats that she never suspected I was quietly maneuvering behind the scenes. She thought she was breaking me down, when in reality she was distracting herself from the storm I was preparing. My neighbors remained largely silent, though I caught more than a few smirks when Karen's back was turned, and I knew they were beginning to sense that her bluster might not be as unshakable as she wanted them to believe. I didn't tell anyone my plan, Not even Dave, though I suspect he knew something was brewing, because he winked at me one evening and said, "Whatever you're cooking up, make sure it's spicy enough to finally shut her up." The morning the papers were finalized, I felt like I was holding a secret too powerful to speak aloud, like a magician with the final piece of his trick tucked in his sleeve, and though Karen paraded around the neighborhood like she was queen of the lake, I knew her throne was already slipping out from under her. Mitchell had called me late the night before to confirm that the marina sale was completed, and that the LLC I had set up now officially owned it free and clear. He congratulated me in his dry lawyer voice, but I could hear the amusement hiding underneath, because he knew exactly how this would play out once the truth surfaced. I walked down to the water with my coffee in hand, listening to the soft lap of waves against the dock, and I laughed quietly to myself because just a week earlier I had been threatened with fines, police, and lawsuits for daring to use what was rightfully mine, and now I owned the one thing the HOA had spent years pretending belonged to them. The weight of the irony was almost too heavy to carry alone, so I let it fuel me as I began the delicate dance of keeping my secret while Karen pushed harder than ever. Karen, oblivious as ever, had doubled her efforts. She sent me certified mail demanding immediate payment of thousands in fines, she slapped neon notices on my door warning of imminent liens, and she strutted around the marina on weekends like she was its rightful queen, pointing at boats and barking orders at families trying to enjoy their day. I watched all of this with quiet amusement, sometimes even walking down to the dock with a fishing pole just to provoke her into another tirade. She would scream about unauthorized use, threaten to escalate to court, and each time I nodded and smiled, my secret burning in my chest like fireworks I could barely keep contained. Neighbors whispered that she seemed more unhinged than usual, and some even began avoiding the marina altogether because the atmosphere had soured under her constant watchful eye. That only made my plan sweeter, because I knew the day would come when I would swing the gates open again, not with her blessing but with mine. Mitchell advised me to keep quiet until the deed had been fully recorded and all paperwork stamped, and though it took every ounce of patience I had, I followed his advice. Instead of revealing my ownership, I quietly visited the marina owners, now former owners, to tour the property, walking through the boathouse, inspecting the slips, and standing on the deck where Karen had once held her loud meetings. The staff, who had long been frustrated by the HOA's constant interference, welcomed me cautiously at first, but when I explained in confidence that I was the new landlord, their eyes lit up with relief. They had grown tired of Karen's overreach, her habit of barging into their offices to demand free use of facilities or berate them for allowing non-HOA members to launch boat. They promised discretion until I was ready to announce things formally, and I promised them that when the time came, the marina would no longer be a stage for Karen's power games but a place for families to actually enjoy. The most delicious part of it all was watching Karen talk about the marina as if it were her crown jewel, while I sat there knowing she was parading on borrowed ground. At one HOA meeting she pounded the table about increasing dues again to cover essential marina maintenance, even though not a dime of that money had ever gone directly to the property because the HOA didn't own it. She screamed about how without her leadership the entire lake would collapse into chaos, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. I sat in the back, arms folded, pretending to be uninterested, while in my pocket was a freshly signed deed that made her every word sound like the ravings of a child playing queen in a cardboard castle. Neighbors grumbled quietly, some questioning the dues hike, others muttering that Karen seemed more focused on me than anything else, but most kept their heads down because that was the spell Karen had always cast, intimidation disguised as authority. I knew the reveal had to be perfect. If I moved too soon, Karen might try to spin the story, claim it was a hostile takeover, or somehow paint herself as the victim. But if I timed it right, if I let her puff herself up until she was certain of her control, then revealed the truth in front of everyone, the collapse would be absolute. Timing was everything, so I waited, and while I waited I let Karen dig her own grave deeper. She issued me a notice threatening to ban me from all marina functions, which made me chuckle because technically she was banning me from my own property. She tried to host a summer kickoff party at the marina, strutting around with a bullhorn, barking about rules and raffles, and I stood at the edge of the crowd, grinning, knowing that within days she would discover she had been throwing parties in my living room without permission. At night I lay awake imagining the look on her face when I announced it. Would her jaw drop? Would she scream? Would she faint? I couldn't decide which version I liked best. Dave, my neighbor, started dropping by more often with beer and stories about how Karen had been knocking on doors, whipping people up with tales about how I was destroying the neighborhood and how only she could save it. He laughed at the absurdity of it, shaking his head and saying people were getting tired of her circus, and I nodded, telling him that patience was the key. He squinted at me suspiciously, maybe sensing that I was hiding something, but he didn't press and I didn't confess, because the payoff depended on secrecy. When Mitchell finally called to tell me the deed was recorded and everything was locked tight, my heart raced so fast I thought it might leap out of my chest. The property was mine, legally and indisputably, and there was nothing Karen or her army of bylaws could do to change it. The time for patience was ending, and the time for spectacle was about to begin. I walked down to the marina that evening, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and I stood on the deck where Karen had once screamed about my supposed violations. I ran my hand along the rail, breathing in the scent of the lake, and I felt like a king surveying his new kingdom. The irony was too rich to ignore. Just days ago I had been humiliated in front of a cop on this very water, and now I owned the jewel Karen thought made her untouchable. But I didn't reveal it that night. No, the reveal had to wait until the next HOA gathering, when the crowd was assembled and Karen was at her loudest, her most arrogant, her most convinced of her invincibility. Until then, I played the role of the embattled neighbor, smiling politely as she handed me another stack of fines, shaking my head as she threatened to sue, and waving from my dock while she screamed across the water. Every performance of hers only added fuel to my fire, because I knew her reign was already over, she just didn't know it yet. Karen's obsession with control grew louder and more desperate in the days that followed, and though I sat quietly with my secret, watching from the sidelines, it was impossible not to notice how frantic she was becoming. She had always been loud, but now her actions bordered on unhinged, as if she sensed the walls closing in without knowing why. One morning I stepped outside to find a bright orange notice nailed to my fence claiming that my repeated violations were grounds for foreclosure proceedings initiated by the HOA, and I had to laugh out loud, the sound echoing across the lake, because the idea that an HOA could foreclose on a man's property over a fishing trip was so absurd it felt like satire. I peeled the notice off and dropped it into a growing pile in my kitchen drawer, a pile of hollow threats that was becoming so thick I considered binding them into a coffee table book someday. Karen, however, strutted past my cabin later that day, smug as a cat with a mouse in its mouth, clearly believing she had finally found a way to break me. What she didn't realize was that her threats were doing the opposite, fortifying my patience, sharpening the blade I planned to drop at the perfect moment. Meanwhile, the HOA board, or rather the small group of weary neighbors Karen had bullied into calling themselves a board, seemed increasingly uncomfortable with her escalating crusade. At the next HOA meeting, Karen arrived with a folder thick enough to choke a horse, filled with photographs of my cabin, my dock, my boat, even my mailbox, which she claimed was non-compliant. She waved them around like evidence in a murder trial, demanding that the community approve an emergency hike in dues to fund the legal battle she swore was imminent. The room shifted uneasily as she ranted, her voice rising higher and higher, and I sat quietly in the back, arms folded, face blank, enjoying the spectacle. A few brave neighbors muttered about how dues were already too high, one man asked what happened to the last hike she pushed through, and another woman asked why the HOA's focus was always on punishing rather than improving. Karen snapped at them like a whip, barking that without strict enforcement the community would collapse into chaos, but her desperation was visible in every twitch of her face. She didn't realize it, but she was alienating the very people she relied on to stay in power. I could have stood up and revealed my ownership of the marina right there, in that crowded meeting hall with Karen red-faced and frothing at the mouth, but the timing wasn't ripe yet. I wanted her to double down, to commit herself so fully to her illusion of control that when the truth finally dropped, she wouldn't be able to spin it. So I let her carry on, scribbling on her whiteboard about how the HOA would take me to court, how the HOA would demand injunctions, how the HOA would reclaim authority over the lake once and for all. The irony made me nearly choke on laughter, because even as she ranted about her control over the lake, the marina she considered her fortress was already mine. The best revenge, I realized, wasn't simply victory, but victory delivered with maximum theater, and theater requires the villain to think they're winning until the curtain drops. As Karen escalated her threats, I began preparing my reveal with the precision of a stage director. I met quietly with Mitchell to discuss legalities, ensuring that my ownership of the marina was airtight and undisputable. He assured me that no HOA bylaw, no newsletter threat, no pile of fines could erase the ink on the deed. I asked him to be on standby for when I unveiled the truth, just in case Karen tried to dispute it, and he agreed, already chuckling at the fireworks to come. I visited the marina in the evenings, walking the docks, greeting the staff, familiarizing myself with every corner of the property that was now mine. Sometimes I imagined Karen strutting across the deck with her bullhorn, completely unaware that every step she took was on my ground. The image never failed to make me grin. But patience was tested daily as Karen's antics grew more ridiculous. She filed noise complaints when I mowed my lawn. She accused me of running an unlicensed business because I had too many tools in my shed. She even called the sheriff one afternoon claiming I was illegally siphoning lake water for irrigation, and when the deputy arrived and saw my tiny garden hose trailing into a patch of tomatoes, he rolled his eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. He gave me a warning to humor her but whispered that he was tired of being dragged out for nonsense. I thanked him and waved cheerfully as Karen watched from her porch, arms crossed, a grin on her face as though she had won some great battle. In reality, every false complaint she filed was another nail in her coffin, because she was alienating not just neighbors but law enforcement too. The tipping point came when Karen tried to host a grand HOA Unity celebration at the marina, a gathering designed to rally the neighborhood behind her crusade against me. She printed glossy flyers, sent out emails laced with digs at my supposed defiance, and even rented a sound system so she could bark her speeches louder than ever. I attended, of course, lurking near the back with Dave and Sarah, sipping lemonade and pretending to be just another neighbor curious about the show. Karen took the stage in front of the boathouse, the very boathouse that now legally belonged to me, and launched into a fiery speech about protecting the community from selfish individuals who thought they were above the rules. She pointed in my direction more than once, and though people clapped politely, the enthusiasm was clearly forced. Some rolled their eyes, some whispered among themselves, and I could feel the room shifting, the spell breaking. That night, as the party wound down and Karen strutted across the marina like she was parading her private estate, I realized the moment was almost ripe. She had made the marina the centerpiece of her power, the proof of her dominance, and the more she flaunted it, the sweeter the reveal would be. I decided to wait for the next official HOA meeting, when attendance was mandatory and Karen would be surrounded by the full audience of neighbors she so desperately wanted to impress. The trap was set, the stage ready, and all I had to do was let her walk into it. In the meantime, I kept up my facade of quiet endurance, letting her believe she was breaking me down with each new notice, each new insult. Inside, though, I was savoring the anticipation like a fine wine. Dave teased me constantly, saying I looked too calm for a man supposedly drowning in fines and foreclosure threat. I would just smile and say patience was a hunter's best friend. Sarah hinted once that she thought I had something up my sleeve, but I deflected, saying only that sometimes bullies defeat themselves if you give them enough rope. She nodded thoughtfully, though I could tell she was dying to know more. The meeting hall was packed tighter than I had ever seen it,